It's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
I'm very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
When you visit schools, people are most likely to tell you what you want to hear through fear of repercussions. That's the message from a primary school teacher in today's press to the Education Secretary, speaking anonymously because she fears being disciplined for speaking out. How does the First Minister think that reflects on her government?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I should say that teachers, parents, sometimes older pupils, email me regularly. I'm sure it's the case for the Deputy First Minister, openly telling us their views on schools. Often they will talk about the very many positives about school education. At other times they will point out things that they think we should be doing better. So my message to any teacher, I've read the letter that Ruth Davidson has referred to, is that nobody should feel unable to come to me or to the Education Secretary and raise concerns at any time. I encourage that, I have always encouraged that, and I always will encourage that. But I also think it's important that we remain very focused on making sure we're investing properly in our schools, reducing where we can unnecessary workload for teachers and taking the action through, for example, the Pupil Equity Fund and the governance reforms in our schools to do what I have said is such a driving priority for this government, which is to raise standards and close the attainment gap. And we will remain absolutely focused on doing exactly that.
Ruth Davidson.
The First Minister talks about reducing workload, but if that work's been undertaken, why do international studies show that our teachers are among the most overworked in the world? But let's just read out a little bit more from the letter that went to Mr Swinney that we all received in the last week. In it, the teacher says that the Scottish Government are not tackling the real underlying issues in education, but are rather just putting a plaster over a gaping wound. And speaking directly to Mr Swinney, she adds, "The most concerning thing that has happened so far is that one of my colleagues arranged to meet with yourself to discuss issues that were of great concern to them. However, this person was warned by their manager that if they went ahead with this meeting, they would be disciplined." Could either the Education Secretary or the First Minister say today whether they knew that that had happened, what action they took, and whether they'll end this culture of fear right now?
Well,
First Minister.
I think it's very important to be clear on this, and I want to be crystal clear on this. And I would say not just to people across this chamber, but perhaps particularly to local authority employers in this regard. In the case that Ruth Davidson has mentioned, the Deputy First Minister agreed to meet with the teacher. It was not the Deputy First Minister that said that meeting could go ahead. So I am very, very clear. It's not acceptable for local authorities to say to any teacher or any member of staff, whatever job they're doing, that they will be disciplined if they approach or raise concerns with government ministers. So I can't be any clearer about that. I will go on being clear about that, and I hope that's a message that is heard loudly and clearly by local authorities right across the country. And I hope Ruth Davidson would agree with that and join with me today in sending that message.
Ruth Davidson.
I'm not sure the First Minister fully gets this, because it's her government that is decreeing to local authorities. And we're not talking about a political opponent here. This teacher isn't point scoring. We're talking about a teacher who in the letter makes clear that she's an SNP supporter and voter, and yet she now feels that she isn't being listened to and has to speak out under the cloak of anonymity in order to avoid being stamped on. So what does it come to when public servants with experience and knowledge in their area are being strong-armed to keep their mouths shut because it might embarrass the Education Secretary? Can the First Minister answer me that?
First Minister.
You know, I have to say that, having read the letter that Ruth Davidson opened with in her first question, there are many serious issues in that letter that Ruth Davidson could have raised today, issues that this government is working hard to address with the teaching profession and with others. But I think on this issue, she is on extremely weak ground indeed. So let me recap for Ruth Davidson's benefit. In this case, the Deputy First Minister agreed to meet a teacher. It was the local authority who advised that teacher not to meet. We do not decree that local authorities should do that. On the contrary, if there's any decree coming from me today to local authorities, is that that is unacceptable. Absolutely. That teachers should be free to contact me as First Minister, the Deputy First Minister as Education Secretary, or indeed any member of my government. So I'm not sure how I can make that any clearer for Ruth Davidson, and perhaps she would be doing a greater service to teachers, instead of standing here and pretending that there's some other policy on the part of the government, would actually be underlining the fact that any teachers anywhere in the country are perfectly free to approach any member of the government. She would do a greater service to teachers if she got that message across loudly and clearly.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, I think the transparency and openness of government is a serious issue that is worth highlighting. And as the teacher says in the letter today, their issue isn't just about resources, it's about workforce planning, it's about a failure to implement policy properly, it's about a failure to listen to people in the front line, a charge that's made front and centre. It's about a culture of fear and secrecy that is currently stopping people from speaking out because of the repercussions for their careers. So we do need an openness in government in Scotland, one which welcomes transparency and scrutiny, not just because a letter was written, a government that asks teachers to tell them what's happening, and not one that forces them to keep their mouths shut. Wouldn't you agree?
First Minister.
Let me issue this message to teachers or to any other public sector worker across the country. Come and tell the government how you feel about your job and your public services, whether that is good or bad, whether that's about positives or things we want to do better. And actually, Ruth Davidson would be better advised to join me in putting that message out there. Openness and transparency is hugely important. That's why the Deputy First Minister is in schools every single week. That's why he and I talk to teachers regularly, not just in my capacity as First Minister, but in my constituency surgeries, of which I do many. And that message is one that we should all convey to teachers. So, for what, the third or fourth time, let me be clear to teachers that they can come and raise anything they want with the government, and let me be very clear to every single local authority of every party administration across the country that it is unacceptable to say to any teacher that they will be disciplined for doing so. So I think I've made that pretty clear, and I hope it's widely understood, not just by Ruth Davidson, but by everybody across Scotland.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, this week the highly respected Joseph Rowntree Foundation published its annual Poverty in Scotland report. It showed that 1 in 4 children in Scotland today live in poverty. The First Minister has set a target to make that less than 1 in 10 by 2030. But what is her target for 2019?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, we welcome the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report. It clearly outlines the challenges we all face in tackling poverty. Of course, the Scottish Government has set targets. I think we're now the only part of the UK that has binding statutory targets in place. We've also set out a range of initiatives we're going to take to meet those targets in terms of our child poverty action plan. But I think it's important to look at some of the detail of the Joseph Rowntree report. I mean, Jim Cormack, the Scottish Director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, said on Good Morning Scotland on Tuesday, it's right to say that the single biggest reason why child poverty is now going in the wrong direction again. The first sustained rise in 20 years is down to the long-run benefits freeze at UK level, the two-child limit and the freeze in tax credits and universal credit. So perhaps the attack by Richard Leonard on the Scottish Government would have more credibility if he was arguing for welfare to be completely devolved to this Parliament. And finally, of course, the report also goes on to praise the forthcoming Scottish Government strategies on disability employment, on the gender pay gap, describing them as transformational, and also praises our approach to the new social security system. So where we have power, we act. The problem is we don't have enough power to do enough that needs to be done.
Richard Leonard.
So let's be clear, the First Minister has a target for 12 years' time, but not for 12 months' time. One act that would make an immediate difference to child poverty is increasing child benefit. Over the last year, this Parliament has passed a Social Security Act and a Child Poverty Act. In voting through both of these acts, SNP MSPs opposed proposals to increase child benefit. Yet this policy has support across Civic Scotland, from anti-poverty organisations to faith groups, from children's charities to the Scottish TUC. They all support the Give Me 5 campaign to raise child benefit by £5 a week. They all support it because it will lift children out of poverty. Does the First Minister know how many children would be lifted out of poverty by this increase?
First Minister.
The estimate shows that that policy would lift 20,000 children out of poverty, which would mean a drop in child poverty of just 2 percentage points. Now, I'm not saying that is insignificant, but what I'm saying is if we are going to introduce an income supplement, which we are committed to doing, we must make sure that the money that is invested in that has maximum effectiveness in tackling child poverty. So what we're looking at is the best way to do that, because the policy that Richard Leonard is proposing, 7 out of every £10 invested through that policy would go to families who are not living in poverty. So the question is, if we're going to invest this scale of money, how do we lift not just 20,000 children out of poverty, how do we use that money to lift even more children out of poverty? That's the work we are doing, and I hope Richard Leonard and his party will get behind it.
Richard Leonard.
In fact, Presiding Officer, the answer to the question I asked is not 20,000 children, it's 30,000 children who would be lifted out of poverty. So, First Minister, that could be your 2019 target. 30,000 children in Scotland lifted out of poverty. Because the report from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation makes clear that it is time, and I quote them, to take decisive steps to make the transformational change. And it also makes clear that many of the tools to tackle poverty and its causes lie in the hands of this Parliament. More flexible and affordable childcare, better housing for all, and a labour market strategy aligned with the goal of reducing poverty. No, because what we have instead is a childcare policy that fits on an SNP leaflet, but not around the lives of working people. A housing policy which offers help to buy to those earnings over £100,000 a year, and a labour market strategy that has been gathering dust on the shelf for over 2 years. Presiding Officer, the SNP has been in office for 11 years. Nicola Sturgeon has been First Minister for 4 years. This is Challenge Poverty Week, so let me challenge the First Minister. How much longer is this government going to tinker around the edges, and how many more children in Scotland will grow up in grinding poverty as a result?
First Minister.
Let me address some of the points that were raised in that. I'm not sure if it was a question rather than a speech, but take childcare. We are in the process right now of doubling childcare for 3- and 4-year-olds and vulnerable 2-year-olds. We're midway through the biggest house building project in the history of this Parliament. I seem to recall it was 6 council houses that the last Labour administration managed to build. Let's look at what the Joseph Rowntree Foundation says about some of our policies, the disability employment strategy, our work and gender pay gap, and I'm quoting right now, this could be transformational for tackling poverty. Our approach to the new social security system could change the family incomes and prospects of thousands of children for the better. And yes, we will continue to focus on how an income supplement, which we are committed to introducing, will lift as many children as possible out of poverty and will not see 7 out of every £10 that we invest of that going to families that don't live in poverty. If we're serious about tackling child poverty, that's the right approach to take. And lastly, Presiding Officer, I don't know about my tenure as First Minister, but Richard Leonard has been leader of the Scottish Labour Party for a lot less time than I've been First Minister of Scotland. And here's what somebody in his party said about him this week. Richard Leonard has no authority over his group. If he's serious about leading Scottish Labour, he should be apologising. I couldn't have summed it up any better.
We have some constituency and other supplementaries. The first from Andy. Order, please. The first from Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that the Scottish Land Court has refused an application to evict a constituent of mine, Jim Telfer, a tenant under the Small Landholders Scotland Act 1911, in order to sell the land to developers to build the Pentland Film Studio that Scottish ministers granted planning consent to in December 2017. Does the First Minister agree that this proposal is now dead in the water, and that the Scottish Government and its agency should take the lead in identifying a site for a film studio that does not involve the unlawful eviction of anyone?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, the judgment by the Scottish Land Court, of course, is a legal matter. I understand that there is likely to be an appeal of that decision, so for obvious reasons I cannot comment on the specifics of it at this time. What I will say is the Scottish Government backs the expansion of the screen sector. We welcome private sector proposals to develop a range of studio infrastructure, but ultimately this is a matter for the current owner of that site ahead of a potential sale to the studio developers. And although we have a role in planning surrounding the project, the issue of land ownership and tenancies is properly considered by the Land Court. Of course, separately to that issue, Creative Scotland is seeking to launch a tender in the autumn, seeking investors to operate a public sector-backed film studio. These plans, of course, are not dependent on the development at the Pentland site.
And Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. Is the First Minister aware of the situation facing tenant farmers David and Alison Telfer, who are being forced off Clifffoot Farm near Langham by the Duke of Buccleuch? Next week, the Duke plans to value their hefted sheep, which have been on the hill for centuries, to be sold to make way for trees. Does the First Minister agree with me that forestry planting grants should never be given in these circumstances, that the Telfers' human rights are being violated by Buccleuch Estates, and that the Duke's sale of the 9,000-acre Evertown portfolio, which includes the Telfers farm and their home, contravenes regulations enacted by the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016, which says that landowners should formally engage with the community ahead of major changes?
First Minister.
Yes, I am aware of this particular case, and I would say that I share Joe McAlpine's concern. Guidance for landowners makes very clear that communities should play a part in decisions about how land is used and managed. I know that the Scottish Land Commission has written to Buccleuch Estates to advise them of how the community should be involved and has offered to provide further advice. Human rights are also reflected in the guidance which landowners, including Buccleuch Estates, should take into consideration during this or any process relating to land transactions. Guidance on the forestry grant scheme state that applicants must have control of the land and a legal right to plant trees on the land. Where control of land changes or comes out of farming, there must be no doubt about the applicant's legal right to plant trees. We intend to add additional guidance to clarify that where an applicant's control of the land or legal right to plant trees is subject to a live legal challenge or review, we would not consider the land to be eligible for a forestry grant until any legal process had been concluded.
And Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This week we've seen Church Place GP surgery in Moffat close its doors forever due to staffing issues. Meanwhile, patients in neighbouring Johnston Bridge have been told that there are no appointments available because there are no doctors to see them. Does the First Minister think that this is acceptable, and in light of these failings, will she back local calls to accelerate plans for a new purpose-built health centre in Upper Annandale?
First Minister.
Well, we will always discuss with health boards plans for new health centres, and of course it's very much for local health boards to decide on local priorities. More generally, we have an aim to increase the number of GPs working in Scotland by at least 800 over the next decade. Investment in primary care is rising. We're taking a range of actions to increase the numbers of medical students going into GP training. In fact, the graduate entry medicine programme, which will have a focus on general practice, starts this year. I know the Health Secretary, Jean Freeman, visited the start of the programme earlier this week. Jean Freeman has also been at the RCGP conference this morning, and many of the tweets I've seen from that were suggesting that the UK Government should look to what the Scottish Government is doing and learn lessons from that. So perhaps the member might want to pass that on. I think the tweet that most drew my attention was, can someone please give Matt Hancock a copy of Jean Freeman's speech?
And another from Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Members across the Chamber were pleased earlier this week when the Sports Minister agreed to engage with all relevant parties about the SPFL's plans to hold both League Cup semi-finals in the same venue on the same day, and even more pleased when those plans were dropped yesterday evening. Will the First Minister continue that engagement and ensure that this is the very last time that those scheduling such major events do so without taking the interests of supporters into account?
First Minister.
Well, these of course are decisions for the footballing authorities, in this case the SPFL, although they should listen to police advice, and I'm glad that the change of opinion has happened this week. In terms of making sure that any appropriate lessons are learned, the Justice Secretary is, and I think perhaps has already, arranged a meeting between Police Scotland and the SPFL to look at what happened this time and how we can make sure that these things don't happen again in future. And I hope football fans of all teams and all colours will welcome that for the future.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
I'm worried about the First Minister. She's not quite herself these days. Our country is facing economic meltdown, but the First Minister is frozen with indecision. For months, I've encouraged her to back a people's vote on Brexit, but she just can't make up her mind. Then I hear this week that she's delayed another independence referendum. That's great news, but I do wonder, does the First Minister believe in anything anymore? I want to encourage the First Minister. I'll be with her if she commits her government to back a people's vote. Time is running out. Will she do that in these desperate days?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, Presiding Officer, can I just make clear to the Chamber that I've been worried about Willie Rennie for an awful long time. So I'm glad that at long last he's reciprocating that mutual concern. There's obviously the start of a long and happy friendship there. On the issue of the people's vote, I've made clear in this chamber, I've made clear to others, the SNP are not going to stand in the way of that. So perhaps Willie Rennie should learn to start taking yes for an answer. But as I said the last time he raised this question, there's also an issue that it would be interesting to hear Willie Rennie address. What happens if, yet again, just as in 2016, Scotland votes to remain and the rest of the UK votes to leave? Is it Willie Rennie's proposition that Scotland should simply be ignored all over again? Is it really Willie Rennie's position that the only people's vote on the EU that counts for nothing is the Scottish people's vote? So perhaps if Willie Rennie can address that question, we might make some progress.
Willie Rennie.
But even her own party doesn't agree with her on that anymore either. This is getting serious. Last week, the car manufacturers spoke out. Yesterday, a life-saving drugs trial was cancelled because of Brexit. Today is the Royal Bank of Scotland. They are all warning about Brexit. More people are coming on board with a people's vote too. The First Minister is not leading the country, she's falling behind the country. Look at the list. Former Conservative Cabinet Ministers, senior Labour politicians, and listen to this, and now the whole SNP Council Group in Aberdeenshire has backed a people's vote. Supporting a people's vote, one SNP councillor said, the only way out of this is to take it back to the people. He's right, isn't he?
First Minister.
Said we don't stand in the way of a people's vote. If there's a people's vote, I'll be perfectly happy with that. But it doesn't guarantee salvation for Scotland, as we saw in 2016. So Willie Rennie is right about one thing. It is really serious. The Tories are leading Scotland to disaster. In the last few days, we've heard warnings of recession, medicine shortage, pressure in food supplies. We've seen the cancellation of a clinical trial at the Golden Jubilee Hospital. But that, for me, makes this point clearer than ever. Scotland needs the option of independence, because only independence guarantees that these things can't be imposed on us against our will. So the sooner Willie Rennie wants to back that, the better.
A few further supplementaries. The first from Gil Patterson.
Many thanks, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that the Golden Jubilee Hospital in my constituency conducts numerous world-leading trials on heart disease and heart failure. It was reported yesterday clinical trials of a new drug have been stopped at the hospital because of concerns over Brexit. The work undertaken at Golden Jubilee is of national, if not global, significance. Therefore, will the Scottish Government raise this issue as a matter of urgency with the UK Government, demanding action to allow this groundbreaking research to go ahead, and, as importantly, ensure that this situation does not reflect on the world-leading research carried out at the Golden Jubilee Hospital?
First Minister.
You know, isn't it very telling that as Gil Patterson was asking that really important question, almost every member of the Scottish Conservative benches were looking at their phones or engaging in conversations, because they do not want to hear, they do not want to engage in the real damage that their Brexit policy is doing to this country. Gil Patterson is absolutely right to raise this issue. It is incredibly serious. The Golden Jubilee Hospital is particularly active in the field of cardiovascular research. We've invested a further £431,000 this year to continue to support its research activity. This is the first clinical study we are aware of to be suspended in Scotland as a result of Brexit. That is deeply concerning and a real sign of what could happen down the line. I understand these trials are continuing elsewhere in Europe, which just underlines the seriousness of this to Scotland. We are working hard, and we will continue to work hard to protect Scotland's interests in spite of a lack of clarity and meaningful engagement from the UK. We will continue to push the UK Government for answers to legitimate questions and concerns about the very real risk Brexit poses to research, clinical trials and access to medicines and staff.
Neil Bibby.
Presiding Officer, Amazon, a company with profits of $2.5 billion and which has received more than £3.5 million of Scottish public money, has finally agreed to pay its employees the living wage, affecting 300 workers in the west of Scotland. The First Minister has welcomed this, as we all would, but is she concerned at reports today that many workers, without any consultation, will be financing their own pay rise with cuts to stock options and benefits, including the seasonal incentive, just as we approach Christmas? Many workers apparently believe that they will be worse off as a consequence. If that is the case, will she agree with the GMB that this could be a case of giving with one hand and taking with another? And before handing out any more money to Amazon, will she take into account this and other bad employment practices, including their continued failure to recognise the trade union?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I welcome the announcement by Amazon earlier this week about payment of the living wage. The Scottish Government, trade unions and others have put a significant amount of pressure on Amazon, so this announcement is particularly welcome. I should say, Neil Bibby talks about public money given by this government to Amazon. The previous Labour administration gave public money to Amazon as well, but it's this government that has pressured Amazon to pay the living wage, and perhaps a bit of recognition of that from Neil Bibby wouldn't have gone amiss. On the issue that's been reported today about share options, we will seek further detail on that from Amazon. If that is true, it is completely unacceptable, and I would absolutely unequivocally condemn that is the case. And we will seek to meet with Amazon both to find out what the situation is there and continue to put pressure on Amazon and on all other companies to treat all of their workers fairly.
James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Will the First Minister update Parliament on the payment of Scotland's new carer allowance supplement? How many payments have now been made, and how will this financial support help carers and their families?
Minister.
Well, more than 75,000 carers have now received the first instalment of the carers allowance supplement. The supplement, of course, is an additional payment of £442 made in 2 instalments throughout the year. That's a big investment. It's an increase of 13% on the current carers allowance. I've had lots of messages over the course of the last couple of weeks from carers saying how much this means to them. Obviously, in practical terms, that money is important to carers who will often be struggling to make ends meet. But I've been struck by how many of them have said to me that it's actually about more than the money. It's the message we send about how much we value the contribution that carers make to our society. So let me today, yet again, put on record my heartfelt thanks to them for all that they do.
John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the Audit Scotland report into NHS funding, particularly NHS Ayrshire and Arran's ability to work within its budgets. Has the First Minister any advice for NHS Ayrshire and Arran on how it might live within its means in future? And does she share my concerns on this matter at the growing indebtedness of NHS Ayrshire and Arran to the Scottish Government?
First Minister.
Well, John Scott obviously is referring to the Audit Scotland Section 22 reports issued this week, referring to NHS Ayrshire and Arran and also NHS Highland. We are working closely with these boards to ensure that we firstly have a full picture of their position in relation to financial management, operational performance and quality of care, and following that work we will consider the need for any further action to be taken or support to be provided. Of course, I'm aware that the Health Secretary will make a statement to the Chamber this afternoon setting out her views on the financial position, not just now of the NHS, but how we ensure the sustainable financial position of the NHS going forward.
Question number 4, Ruth Maguire.
To ask the First Minister what impact the disclosure scheme for domestic abuse in Scotland has had since its introduction in 2015.
First Minister.
The disclosure scheme for domestic abuse in Scotland, introduced after Claire Wood's tragic death, has enabled over 3,500 people to request information for themselves or for someone they feel may be at risk of domestic abuse. The Police Scotland scheme, which I was proud to help announce when it was introduced nationally in 2015, has informed almost 1,600 people about their partner's abusive past, and put simply, this may well have saved lives. It's one of a number of measures which make a difference for victims. The Domestic Abuse Act, passed earlier this year, creates a specific domestic abuse offence that covers not just physical abuse but also coercive and controlling behaviour, and that sends an unequivocal message that any type of domestic abuse is completely unacceptable.
Ruth Maguire.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. Based on the figures out this week, it's hard to argue that this scheme, rolled out after a successful trial in Ayrshire, has been anything other than a success. Scottish Women's Aid acknowledge it as a great tool for breaking the silence around coercive control and the violence of domestic abuse, helping women who may have been unaware of their partner's past. How will the Scottish Government continue to promote this scheme and other supports to those who face the threat or live with the reality of a violent or abusive partner?
First Minister.
Well, the scheme has indeed been a success, and I think it's a credit to the dedicated Police Scotland officers and victim support organisations who work tirelessly to support people through the disclosure process and to prevent people becoming victims. Applications from individuals using their right to ask have increased by almost 40% in the last 12 months, which demonstrates that the scheme is being used. The Scottish Government is investing record levels of funding to support victims of gender-based violence through a range of frontline services. That includes funding to Scottish Women's Aid to train a pool of expert coercive control trainers throughout Scotland, and development of a range of resources to support groups and external organisations, including local violence against women partnerships. And we will continue this support to make sure that domestic violence is reduced and that victims have as much protection as possible.
Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On promoting the scheme in this week, when we celebrate older people and age Scotland 75 years, can the First Minister advise if the Government has linked up with Action on Elder Abuse to make older people aware of this disclosure scheme, as domestic abuse knows no age boundaries?
First Minister.
Well, Christine Graham is absolutely right. Domestic abuse is an abhorrent crime, and she's absolutely right to point out that it occurs across society, regardless of age, gender, race, sexuality and wealth. To deliver the scheme, Police Scotland already works closely with a number of independent domestic abuse advocacy and support services. The disclosure scheme, and I want to stress this point, is open to anyone, including concerned relatives, neighbours or friends, who can make an inquiry if they're worried about someone being at risk of domestic abuse. In addition, the police have appointed Safe Lives to train 14,000 officers in identifying and controlling behaviours to support the introduction of the new Act, and that will reinforce the fact that domestic abuse can occur in all parts of our society and will include examples of abuse involving older persons. In light of Christine Graham's question, I'm happy to ask officials to look at whether there is more in conjunction with the police that can be done to draw attention of this scheme and the wider legislation around domestic abuse to older people in our society.
Question number 5, Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking in response to reports that there has been the biggest rise in HIV infection in Scotland for 3 decades.
First Minister.
Well, as we have set out in our sexual health and bloodborne virus framework, prevention of HIV transmission remains a priority in Scotland. I'm very proud that Scotland was the first part of the UK to make HIV PrEP available on the NHS last year. We're working closely with NHS boards to reduce blood support Glasgow's proposals for safer injecting facilities, and the Minister for Public Health is meeting with his counterpart in Westminster later this month to discuss the case for urgent action to consider that proposal or to devolve the necessary powers to allow this Government and Parliament to consider it.
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. In 2016, funding for alcohol and drug partnerships was cut by 15 million, and the Scottish Government asked health boards to make up the difference. They did not make up that shortfall, and in total alcohol and drug spending has been reduced since last year. Therefore, can I ask, in this year's budget, will the First Minister and her Government commit to being completely transparent and provide the Parliament with a single figure for spending across these treatments?
First Minister.
Well, of course, in last year's programme for Government, I indicated increased resources for drug and alcohol treatment services. Our budget this coming year will continue to prioritise action in those areas. I think perhaps a subsidiary question is whether, when it does so, the Scottish Conservatives will actually vote for the budget or vote against it because they prefer tax cuts for the richest in our society, which would remove the funding we need for these very issues. So we will continue to provide the funding, we will continue to work with the relevant organisations, and we will continue to argue for the innovation in public policy that can help us tackle these issues. That's why the Safer Injecting Facility proposal is so important, and I would say in all sincerity to the member, perhaps he can help us in trying to persuade his colleagues at Westminster to stop being a block on that proposal.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A Freedom of Information request by the Liberal Democrats reveals that in NHS Lothian there are currently 125 people waiting up to 84 days for repeat prescriptions for prophylactic HIV medication PrEP. Given HIV is growing and 13% of Scots who have it don't know they have it, will the First Minister and her Cabinet Secretary work with NHS Lothian to end this delay, which is the largest in this country?
First Minister.
Well, the availability of PrEP is important. As I said in my initial answer to this question, Scotland was actually the first part of the UK to make it available on the NHS, and that was the right thing to do. I will certainly discuss with the Public Health Minister and the Health Secretary how we can work with NHS Lothian to make sure that it is available to people who need it as quickly as possible. And I'm sure Alex Cole-Hamilton, we disagree on many things. I think on these issues there's a lot of agreement. He's certainly on occasion been helpful to the Government in pursuing some of the policy here. So I will ask the Health Secretary or the Public Health Minister to correspond with him, particularly on this point that he's raised.
Question number 6, Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government is doing to ensure that all historic complaints of harassment within its workplace are properly investigated and dealt with.
First Minister.
Well, it is of course a year ago that allegations emerged about Harvey Weinstein, and through the Me Too movement, the world woke up to the experiences that many women face. In light of these concerns, I asked the Permanent Secretary to review the Scottish Government's policies to ensure that staff could have confidence that all complaints would be fully investigated and properly addressed. As part of this, the Fairness at Work policy was reviewed for all staff, and also a new procedure was put in place that allows any historic cases to be considered and ensures that staff are clear about how they can make a complaint. It's absolutely vital that we give people the confidence to come forward in the knowledge that they will be listened to and that their complaint will be fully investigated, irrespective of who the complaint relates to or when they occurred. I'm sure that the whole Chamber will agree with me that the complainants should always be at the centre of our thoughts and that we conduct ourselves always in a way that ensures that complainants are properly protected and respected and that complaints are properly investigated.
Rhoda.
The First Minister talked about the Me Too campaign, and it has raised hopes that we develop a very different culture from the one that swept these issues under the carpet. However, it would appear from press reports that some historic complaints were not recorded and not dealt with appropriately or taken seriously. And if this is indeed the case, perpetrators may have gone without challenge, as there was no way of seeing if this behaviour was a course of conduct. Is the First Minister aware of any such cases, and what is she doing about them? What action will she take to ensure proactively that all historical complaints made to the Scottish Government and to any of its agencies have been properly investigated, recorded and dealt with?
First Minister.
No, I'm not aware of any complaint having been swept under the carpet, and let me be very clear, as First Minister, I would not tolerate that being the case. Indeed, it's because I believe so strongly that complaints shouldn't be swept under the carpet that I signed off the new procedure in December that I referred to in my opening answer. I'm very clear and have been consistently clear, as has the Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government, that when complaints are raised, they should be properly investigated, no matter the seniority or the political affiliation of the person being complained about. And what is important in all cases is that there is due process applied. And the final point I would make here is, I think, and this is directed at all of us across this chamber, I think all of us should refrain from seeking to play party politics on issues that demand proper due process, because to do that risks doing a disservice to those who raise complaints.
Sinead Robertson.
Would the First Minister agree with me that the behaviour that we've seen last week from President Trump and several US senators who have effectively put a woman who says she's been a victim of abuse on trial is utterly disgraceful, and that furthermore we should stand together and not allow those who complain to be re-victimised as part of any political or media scrutiny of any harassment investigation?
First Minister.
I absolutely agree. I think many of us, perhaps women in particular, have been horrified at what we have watched unfolding in the United States over the last couple of weeks. I think in this area leadership is very important, and these issues are not always comfortable. I perhaps know that more than most at this point, but it is at times when things are not comfortable that leaders are tested about whether their rhetoric is just that or whether they're prepared to put that into action. I think it is really important that when people come forward with complaints, they are not put on trial, but that there is due process for all concerned, for those bringing forward complaints and indeed for those being complained about. We mustn't allow complaints to be swept under the carpet. We certainly mustn't allow that to happen because of the identity of the person being complained about. It is vitally important that women, because it mainly, or not exclusively, but mainly in this regard is women are listened to and their complaints are treated with respect and with due process. And as far as I possibly can as First Minister, I will do everything in my power to make sure that happens.
Thank you very much, and that concludes First Minister's questions. We'll move on shortly to members' business in the name of Elaine Smith on challenging poverty, but before we do so, we'll just take a short suspension to allow the gallery, the public gallery in particular, to clear and for new members of the public to come in to listen to this debate. A short suspension.
time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Thank you. Can I ask those members of the public still leaving to leave so quietly as the Parliament is still in session? The next item of business is a members' business debate on motion 14031 in the name of Elaine Smith on Challenge Poverty Week. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Elaine Smith to open the debate. Ms Smith, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start with an opposite observation from R.H. Tawney? What thoughtful rich people call the problem of poverty, thoughtful poor people call with equal justice the problem of riches. Presiding Officer, having met with the Poverty Alliance, I lodged the motion to mark Challenge Poverty Week, and I thank members for the big cross-party support that it secured, and I also thank those who are staying today to take part in the debate, and I look forward to hearing other contributions. And also, members may wish to call in to meet the Poverty Alliance in room TG 2021 after the debate. This year's message is Challenge Poverty in Scotland, we can, and there are three core themes. Poverty exists in Scotland and affects us all. Poverty can be solved by boosting incomes and reducing costs, and solving poverty is about ensuring that we can all participate in society. And the wide range of activities taking place in communities around Scotland should leave us in no doubt of the commitment to offer support to those who are currently caught in the poverty trap, whilst also speaking up together and taking responsibility for providing solutions. Presiding Officer, a recent report from NHS Lanarkshire highlighted that nearly 1/5 of children living in Lanarkshire are growing up in poverty. And in some parts of the Central Region, I know that this will be much higher, and I'm sure that we will all agree that this is unacceptable. These worrying statistics are not only to be found in the old industrial areas of higher deprivation in Lanarkshire. Here in Edinburgh last year, on the doorstep of this Parliament, there has been an 18% increase in the use of food banks. That was over 9,500 people with 96 tonnes of food distributed through food boxes in Edinburgh during 2017. This cannot become normalised and repeated year on year. And we also saw a report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation this week saying that, and I quote, barriers to the labour market due to disability, ill health and childcare responsibilities remain prevalent characteristics of child poverty. John Dickey, head of Child Poverty Action Group, says, if we are serious about ending poverty in Scotland, it is vital that we build the public support needed to make real change happen. Challenge Poverty Week is a great opportunity to work together to highlight the damage that poverty wreaks and create the pressure needed for real action to end it. Presiding Officer, as this is a members' debate, it gives us the opportunity to put aside party political differences and to promote ideas for tackling poverty. And of course the solutions we propose may differ. For example, Labour supports the Give Me 5 campaign. I am sure though that nobody in this chamber wants to see children going hungry in modern Scotland. Presiding Officer, of particular concern is the fact that getting a job does not provide the security of adequate food and shelter for families that it should. Thousands of households living in poverty contain at least one adult in work. It used to be, of course, that securing employment was one of the routes out of poverty, but it seems no longer. And of course, changes to family and child tax credits are also likely to cause more in-work poverty. In terms of barriers to the labour market, cited in the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, as policymakers we can take action to change the system of work to enable more parents to access good quality employment that suits their circumstances. Responsibility to tackle gross inequality and the poverty that underpins it must rest with all of us. Now, I commend the work being done by the many charities and organisations across Scotland, and I'm sure we're going to hear more details of that in the debate. I specifically, in my motion, mentioned the event that's going to be held at the Conforti Institute in Coatbridge, and I just have to put on the record that it's recently been renamed as Xaverian Missionaries Conforti, so we ought to get that right. This event is entitled Stories from the Edge, Church Action in Poverty, and it's going to bring together faith-inspired social activists to share stories, to critically reflect and explore existing aspects of what makes a good society. The Scottish Parliament has in the past recognised that faith organisations and communities have long been at the heart of providing support and assistance to those in need, and I would like today to reiterate our thanks for the work they do. But whilst we thank and commend volunteers and churches for their much-needed interventions, it really isn't good enough in 21st century Scotland for those in poverty to have to depend on Victorian-style Christian charity. We really must say that. And we must respond, of course, to the immediate problem, but we also need a fundamental shift in social policy to ensure the eradication of poverty and inequality. Along with many others here today, I recall the Make Poverty History marches of 2005, and I recognise the shared beliefs that we can and must change the way our society is organised. The economy we have today was designed. It's the result of a set of decisions that were made about our society's priorities and resources. And just as it was designed, we can redesign it so that it works for everyone. Last month saw the publication of a report, Prosperity and Justice, by the Institute for Public Policy's Commission on Economic Justice. The report is the product of a 2-year inquiry, and its publication is timely as we reflect on the 10th anniversary of the banking crisis of 2008. The report details the Commission's belief that a new moral purpose is needed to define the goals of economic policy and offers a vision of what this could be. It argues that the economy needs to deliver prosperity and justice together, and it explains what is meant by these terms and how they relate to one another. Archbishop Welby of Canterbury, a member of the Commission, spoke out as the report was launched, saying, "Prosperity depends on the security and quality of work, the balance of work and life, the quality of our relationships, and not just about the amount of income we receive. It rests on the common good as well as individual well-being." Challenge Poverty Week shines a spotlight again on the willingness of communities to rally round and offer a helping hand. And I'm pleased that I've been able to work with the Poverty Alliance and the organisations involved. But this is also about the future. A future where local government can provide the public services we all need, investing in our communities. A future where every family has high-quality, affordable housing, access to secure, well-paid work with a flexibility to suit all, and the resources to feed and clothe themselves without recourse to charity. A future where the gap between the richest and the poorest in our society is no longer extreme. The question is, can we do this as a parliament, as a government, as a country? And the answer has to be, aye, we can, but only if we recognise that significant interventions are needed to properly challenge poverty. Presiding Officer, can I just finish with this? Next week, Blessed Oscar Romero will be made a saint of the Roman Catholic Church. He spoke out against poverty and social injustice, assassinations and torture. In 1980, he was murdered, and I will simply end with his words. "It is not God's will that some people have everything and others have nothing." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Swift. I call Stewart McMillan to be followed by Alexander Stewart. Mr McMillan, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I want to congratulate Elaine Smith for securing this important debate, and also to thank her for hosting the drop-in session that I will be attending after this members' debate. Elaine Smith and myself will disagree on many things, but also know we are very much in agreement on a range of things as well, including the scourge of poverty. As we know, poverty affects too many households and people across the country and also globally. It blights lives, it diminishes hope, and it can also lead to a feeling of helplessness and can be a contributing factor in addiction. And Presiding Officer, if dealing with poverty was easy, it would have been done by now. However, exacerbating the issue is something that is totally unforgivable, and I'm going to come on to that point in a moment. Ultimately, poverty is one of society's challenges that we, irrespective of party affiliation, need to take seriously. Now, the motion highlights the event taking place tomorrow in the Conforti Institute, or the renamed institute in Coatbridge that Elaine Smith spoke about. And I want to highlight the event both that Ronnie Cowan MP and myself are hosting tomorrow in the Greenock and Inverclyde constituency. We're hosting a Challenge Poverty event at the A's Business Centre in Greenock. We've promoted it as a money and heating advice surgery. We'll be joined by representatives from iHeat, Ideas, Financial Fitness and also Christians Against Poverty. The first three are local organisations who have helped and continue to help many people locally. And the event runs between 11 AM and 1 PM. If anyone watching this or reading the official report knows of someone locally who could be helped, please let them know. Presiding Officer, I want to thank the organisations who have provided briefings for today's debate. And to some people, the figures might be just numbers on a sheet of paper, but in reality, these are people's lives that are being challenged every single day. Now, according to the Poverty Alliance briefing, and I quote, 1 million people living in the grip of poverty, including 230,000 children. 65% of all children living in poverty live in working households, and 59% of all working-age adults living in poverty live in working households. And according to Oxfam, and I quote, some 8% of adults experienced food insecurity in 2017, defined as being worried they would run out of food due to a lack of money or resources. In our most deprived areas, this figure is 18%, and 1 in 10 people are reported running out of food over a 12-month period. Presiding Officer, what kind of society thinks it's fine for people to worry about eating? And what kind of society thinks it's fine for parents to worry about how they're going to feed their kids? And I've spoken before about food banks in this chamber. In fact, I led the first members' debate on the issue. But the situation has got worse. Now, my office is a food bank collection point. I help the food bank and I'm in regular communication with representatives from it. And during the summer, I spent a few hours at the Inverclyde Food Bank, and I put out an appeal because they were running out of food. And last night on Twitter, we were informed once again that they were running out of food. The Inverclyde Food Bank needs pasta sauce, cereal, tinned fish, tinned fruit, rice pudding or custard, UHT milk, diluting juice, and also coffee. Now, President Officer, this is disgusting. What makes it worse is that the policies that have came from Westminster, including the rape clause and welfare reform, including the rollout of universal credit, has made this worse. Universal credit was introduced into Inverclyde in November 2016, and with a 6-week lead-in time before any payment, how does anyone seriously think this was going to be seamless? Then there has been the poverty wages some businesses have paid, and the continual short-term contracts, including zero-hour contracts, to name just further examples. Presiding Officer, when the UK Government create a new Minister for Food Supplies to deal with the post-Brexit situation, then what comfort does this provide to those already living in poverty and also in food poverty? Absolutely none. Now, we have a heartless Tory government with 8 years of 10 years delivering austerity, saying also this cannot continue. People are already struggling. They cannot continue to live like this. Now, I'll end on this point, Presiding Officer. When a primary school child tells the staff in a food bank that in the past they fed that child and their family, what kind of impression will that leave on the staff, but also about the bravery of that child? Now, this is the reality of poverty in our communities, Presiding Officer. It's disgusting, it's abhorrent, and the sooner the Tories start considering all the communities that they represent, and not just the rich, then not just the chosen few, then maybe their colleagues in Westminster might just consider the less well-off in Scotland and also elsewhere across the UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms McMillan. I call Alexander Stewart to be followed by James Kelly. Mr Stewart, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in today's debate, and I commend and congratulate Elaine Smith for securing this motion today. As we already have heard, Challenge Poverty Week runs from the 1st to the 7th of October and highlights the challenges and the realities of people suffering from poverty. The event has an annual event, and the We already talked about the Poverty Alliance, which is actively involved and have been working in this field since 1992. Growing out of an informal network of groups, individuals and activities back in the 1980s, the membership of that organisation is very wide and varied, and I think that's exactly what it needs to be, to ensure that we can look at the issue social inclusion and poverty that individuals are suffering. Its membership is made up of a wide range of organisations, and these include grassroots community groups, individuals facing poverty, voluntary organisations, statutory organisations, policymakers and academics. It also acts as a national poverty network in Scotland, working with organisations and policymakers in the UK and also Europe-wide. Two of the Challenge Poverty Week aims are to highlight the reality of poverty and challenge the stereotypes that exist about it, and to demonstrate what is being done to access Scotland with poverty in individuals and organisations. Shirley?
Neil Finlay.
Groups in his own region and speaking to groups over the last week or so, every one of them, I'm sure, has told him that the introduction of universal credit and the benefits cuts are one of the key components of the increase in poverty. Does he accept that? That every one of them tell him the same story? Does he accept that?
Alexander Stewart.
Thank you for your intervention. I acknowledge what you're saying. The individuals do feel that they are being challenged, and the Westminster Government has been mentioned in this Parliament already today, and the rules and the occupations that they put out to individuals may well have an impact. I see that in my own parts of the constituency, and I acknowledge that. To demonstrate that each organisation is there to ensure that their groups will tackle poverty and challenge the way going forward. However, to achieve the aims of this organisation across Scotland, they're organising things and events to take place to try and capture and ensure that individuals have the ability to ensure that they are actively involved. And that may be distributing information, supporting them, making sure that they come and speak to politicians. And I think it's vitally important that we do, as politicians, listen to the views and opinions that are being discussed by individuals. Also, that they focus on activities that ensure that individuals get the right and the opportunity to go out in their communities and do that. With a clear focus on their priorities, they want to highlight, and they also want to deal with and tackle poverty across Scotland. And we can all look towards what we can all do in future to create a bigger impact on everyone's lives and examine ways in which people and organisations can ensure that they do have that self-confidence, that they do have that dignity and that outlook. Deputy Presiding Officer, Challenging Poverty Week shows the vision, and it's there to try and end child poverty, to listen to those affected by poverty, and to invest in high-quality education. That's vitally important. In short, it's vital that we respect everybody's human rights and give them the dignity to ensure that the circumstances they find themselves in, and to ensure that the vision that is there, it should be highly commended. We need to address poverty by tackling inequality, supporting individuals on low incomes, supplying them with information about money and debt advice, ensuring that people facing injustices at poverty get the support they require to give them the confidence to manage their money effectively and to manage their resources so they can make responsible decisions. I commend and congratulate Elaine Smith and others for all the work they're doing in this and look forward to seeing progress moving forward. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I call James Kelly to be followed by Alison Johnson. Mr Kelly, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to start by congratulating Elaine Smith on securing the debate this afternoon in support of Challenge Poverty Week. It's a very, very important issue, and as others have said in the debate, it resonates throughout our constituencies and regions. You just need to look at the statistics in some of the briefings. The recent Joseph Rowntree Foundation report illustrates that there are 230,000 kids living in poverty in Scotland, and the Oxfam briefing highlights the fact that 860,000 individuals are in poverty in Scotland. You know, that is a scandal for a modern, progressive country, and it's something that we all have a responsibility to address. But it's not just those statistics. It's a story behind that. You know, what is actually happening on the ground. And the reality is that there are still too many people not in work or, you know, struggling, as others have said, you know, against the oppressive policies pursued by the UK government in relation to benefit changes. And in relation to that, even those in work, some are working in 2 and 3 jobs. Over 400,000 people not being paid a living wage. And what that then means is that they don't have enough money to live in proper housing, to heat and enclothe their families. And their kids then grow up in a situation where they maybe aren't, you know, able to have a breakfast before they go out to school in the morning, and they're not therefore best placed to make the most of the educational opportunities before them, and don't get their best chances in life. So there's a whole story behind the poverty statistics. You know, people struggling on low wages, living in poor housing, living in poor health, and basically not getting the opportunity to live their lives with respect and dignity. And there's a challenge to all of us in fighting against that. I want to illustrate the work of one local group in Whitlaburn. I visited the Whitlaburn Resource Centre earlier this week as part of Challenge Poverty Week to look at the work of the Whitlaburn hub, and I spoke to Fiona Boyle there. And there were 3 important strands to the work of that group. They've basically got an IT facility which allows people who are out of work to come to the hub and to get advice about their skills, to get advice about building their CVs, also to use IT facilities and get training in that to access what they need in terms of building CVs. It's also important laying a foundation for volunteers in order to train people who come to use the IT facilities up. And this hub has helped in terms of getting people back into work and also raising their confidence and self-esteem, which can often be destroyed as a result of the poverty that they're living in. Stuart McMillan rightly was highly critical of the UK government, and a lot of the policies that are causing this poverty have been driven by the UK government, and it's right that we speak out against that and campaign against it. But there's also a responsibility for us in this Parliament. We heard yesterday that the Scottish Budget is going to be published on the 12th of December, and I think there's an onus on the government to look at the policies in that budget and the spending commitments on that budget to ensure that we're doing something real and live in order to tackle poverty. So if we're going to really tackle these stats, we need a commitment from all levels of government and all MSPs in this chamber.
Thank you very much, Mr Kelly. I call Alison Johnson to be followed by Claudia Beamish. Ms Johnson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too congratulate Elaine Smith on giving us the opportunity to really try to begin to make more of a difference in this Challenge Poverty Week. And I'd like to thank all of those organisations who have provided us with briefings today. Elaine Smith noted in her speech that members' business shouldn't be as confrontational, perhaps, as other debates, but I really do find it very difficult to contribute today without noting the context in which this debate takes place. I mean, it's clear that there is a very important role for employers in addressing poverty. It's clear that there's an important role for schools in addressing poverty. But, you know, let's look at schools. We discuss regularly in this chamber the attainment gap. And quite frankly, it is simply impossible to reduce that educational attainment gap if we don't reduce the gap that is caused by poverty. You know, how can you possibly do your best at school if you haven't had, you know, decent meals the night before, if your parents haven't had enough time to do your homework with you because they've been busy at their second or perhaps third job of that day, and that job isn't one that pays enough. So there is a role for all of us in this, absolutely.
Elaine Smith.
I thank the member very much for taking an intervention. I wonder if you should also recognise that holiday hunger is an issue, and schemes like Food 365 in North Lanarkshire help with that as well?
Yeah.
Alison Johnson.
I couldn't agree more with the member. Holiday hunger is an issue. It's one that's began to be recognised and realised. I mean, you can only imagine how some families feel, you know, faced with a 6 or 7 week school holiday when perhaps that meal at school has been the one hot meal of the day, or perhaps the only meal of the day. So, you know, this recognition is really welcome. I've always felt conflicted about the food bank issue. You know, congratulate those who donate, those who collect, those who work in these food banks, but the fact that this has become a normal part of life in this country is, you know, I think it's a matter of huge concern, and it's one we really need to seek to address. Nobody should have to go to a food bank. People should have enough money in their pocket to be able to go with their family and choose the food they want. And, you know, Stewart McMillan picked up on the emails that we do receive as parliamentarians, letting us know what food banks are running short of. And are these really the foods that we would be recommending, you know, when we look at becoming a good food nation? I think all too often not. They're tinned. You know, they're not. Well, we know that many families who are living in poverty and perhaps are living in B&Bs don't have access to food and heating. All these issues, of course, are interrelated. I think this Parliament has done much good work on this issue. You know, the fact that dignity and respect is going to be put at the heart of the social security system, and we're seeing some of that in action. We do need to do as much as we possibly can to boost income, so schemes like Healthier, Wealthier Children will have an impact. The fact that we're beginning to recognise that carers need more support is massively welcome. But, you know, when we look at the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the United Nations, you know, talking about the impact the cuts to social security and other support to disabled people is having, you know, families with a disabled parent or child are, you know, they really are bearing the brunt of these cuts. And I think when we're looking at challenging poverty, we have to recognise that these things are having a devastating impact. You know, our schools in Edinburgh and Lothian at the moment are being asked to contribute to food banks as part of their Harvest Festival events, and it's really come to this in one of the wealthiest economies on the face of the planet. Presiding Officer, I know that I've run out of time, but I would like to, you know, thank Elaine Smith again for giving us the opportunity to challenge poverty this week, and just to say that as we go forward in everything that we do in this place, we should be making sure that we are doing just that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I call you, Ms Beamish, due to the number of members still wishing to speak in the debate, I am minded to accept a motion under Rule 8.14.3 that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. And I invite Elaine Smith to move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So moved.
The question is under Rule 8.14.3, the debate is extended by up to 30 minutes. Are we agreed? Thank you very much. I now call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Sandra White. Ms Beamish, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I too would like to thank Elaine Smith for bringing this grave matter to debate. This year's Challenge Poverty Week gives us an opportunity to highlight some brilliant organisations and which help to alleviate the scourge of poverty across Scotland. One such organisation is Healthy Valleys, based in Lanark, in my region of South Scotland. It works to promote health and well-being across the Clydesdale area, and Healthy Valleys is helping to transform communities and individuals' lives by working with them to solve problems, build resilience, empower them to find solutions which tackle and relieve the impact of poverty, particularly for children, vulnerable adults and older people. But some areas of rural Clydesdale have child poverty percentages of 46%, compared to the national average, which is intolerable in itself. Healthy Valleys provides practical support and opportunities to improve people's circumstances, such as child health and wellbeing programmes, parental support and, importantly, social prescriptions. It is a real challenge to engage with those who are hard to reach to participate equally in a community life. And particularly successful schemes by Healthy Valleys is the community health cafes, which I have visited. And they are led by volunteers, and these cafes help reduce isolation and loneliness, and they allow people to have a cooked meal on site and take one home with them. So I congratulate Healthy Valleys on their work in my region and other organisations and groups across Scotland and wish them every success in the future. However, I cannot stand here today without saying we should not have poverty in the 21st century here in Scotland. Of course, people want to do things for themselves and their communities. And as a member of the Scottish Cooperative Party MSP group, I hear of and I support empowering cooperative models across all sectors, including energy, farming, housing and childcare. And indeed, last week, in the cross-party group, which my colleague James Kelly convenes, for co-ops, there was a student co-op organisation here in Edinburgh, which is successfully bucking the trend of rip-off rents by private student landlords. However, zero-hours contracts, in-work poverty, child poverty are systemic in our society, and tax cuts for the rich and benefit cuts for the most vulnerable are a stark legacy of Tory rule, and that should not be ducked by Tories here in Scotland as well. The Resolution Foundation highlighted the largest single-year increase in child poverty last year since the 1980s. This has been made even more obvious by the recent release of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation annual report. And this also highlights that the SNP are not using the powers of the Scottish Parliament effectively. It is clear that the failures of the Scottish Government to use their powers to tax the rich and to share the proceeds across local authorities and voluntary sector organisations is contributing to destroying lives. One example from yesterday, which is as convener of the cross-party group for carers, and Alison Johnson's highlighted the issue of carers, I heard of cuts to respite care, inability to secure funding for transition programmes and much more. And last week, at the cross-party, I'm afraid I can't, I'm in my last minute. And last week, the cross-party group for cooperatives about a serious challenges faced by them. We need a system change. A future Labour government at the UK level plans to invest in transformational funds, a statutory £10 living wage, and so much more. And here in Scotland, in government, we would introduce the Mary Barber law, increase child benefit, and do so much more here with this government, with the powers that we have. We would tax those who can afford to pay more to have a more equal society in Scotland. And let me be clear, someone, just one person in poverty is one person too many. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Sandra White, to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I also thank Elaine Smith and congratulate Elaine for securing this debate. As members have already said, 21st century, Scotland, a rich nation, and here we're looking at 230,000 children living in poverty. It's unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable. I will go on to the social security part in a minute, but I have to say to Claudia Beamish, perhaps if your party had given the full powers and support, we would have the full powers of social security. So please remember that. We could have had the full powers. No, I'm sorry, I have to go on. I just want to say, Presiding Officer, Challenge Poverty Week is an opportunity for everyone to raise their voice against poverty and show what is being done to tackle poverty across Scotland. And as others have said, the main aims of the week are highlighting the reality of poverty. But like other members here, Stewart McMillan and also Alison as well, and I appreciate what Elaine Smith has said about normally it's consensual. I think there is absolutely no doubt that the actions by the Tory government in Westminster are making more and more people worse off and driving them into poverty. And I think we have to give some credit to what the Scottish Government is trying to do without all the powers of an independent country. And I'd just like to put forward a couple of things, can't go through all of it. We are the only part of the UK with legally binding targets to reduce child poverty, brought in by the Child Poverty Act. £12 million invested in intensive employment support for parents. Increased funding for the Workplace Equality Fund. That's something. And a new minimum payment of £100 per child for the school clothing grant, which is a shame that kids have even got to get a grant for clothes. We're way back to the 50s and 60s. And then I come on to, of course, the new Social Security Agency, which will treat people, as Alison Johnson has said, with dignity and respect. And I come back to that point again. What a pity we don't have all of the powers in that agency, which we could tackle better with poverty. Now, we're talking about perhaps things that's going to be happen. Well, tomorrow in my constituency, myself and Patrick Grady MP are putting together and holding in the eve of universal credit. We're having a roadshow on universal credit because it comes into my constituency in Partick this month and it covers some of Patrick Grady's MP's area too. And it's not just us that will be there, there'll be community groups, but there'll also be people there from CAB and the DWP to hopefully give advice to people. And it's been said, even by Dave Stewart, the Conservatives, that yes, our post bag is full. And we see people every other day in our constituencies who are suffering the cuts through universal credit. And I want to go to another aspect which is happening in my constituency also, and that's the Refugee Survival Trust. And they're taking part in Challenge Poverty Week in the Kelvin Hall next week. Now, a lot of people don't take that into account, but poverty and destitution are issues that affect every part of society, and its impact falls pretty disproportionately when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers also. It's a pretty precarious position that they find themselves in, so I'm really pleased that the Refugee Survival Trust is holding this to give information to these people who are absolutely becoming destitute, really sleeping in the streets as well, and impoverished as well. So, Presiding Officer, we must all strive to end poverty, but it's a disgrace that it's happening in Scotland in the 21st century. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms White. I call Claire Baker to be followed by Neil Findlay. Ms Baker, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by congratulating Elaine Smith on securing this debate. I want to particularly focus on food security, which other members have mentioned. It is a disgrace that in recognising modern-day poverty in Scotland and across the UK, food security is an almost accepted part of poverty. When food banks first opened, there was a degree of shock that people couldn't afford food, that it was immoral for people to have to access a charity in order to feed themselves. In 2011, when I first went to talk to a food bank, I had to go up to Dundee because there was none in Fife at that time. There are now 8 in Fife, run by and supported by volunteers who are working really hard day in, day out to try and support the needs of their communities. So food banks are now an important part of our support infrastructure, but they often struggle to meet demand. Kirkcaldy Food Bank is having to spend at least £8,000 a month to supplement their donations. And research from Fife Council suggests there are at least 24,000 adults living in food insecure households in Fife, though this is thought to be an underestimation. The drivers for this are identified as changes to the welfare system, rising living costs, job insecurity and continuing low wages. The Scottish Health Survey was published last week and for the first time included a question on food insecurity. It revealed that 8% of adults experienced food insecurity in 2017. This figure rose to 21% for single parents. And in amongst concerns over food shortages, there's also the issue of the quality of food that people on low incomes are able to access. And the recent Food Foundation report highlights that the poorest fifth of families would have to spend 40% of their income, their weekly income, on food if they were to meet the government's healthy living advice targets. So prior to the school summer holidays, I wrote to the local authorities in my region to ask them what they were doing to plan to address the issue of holiday hunger. Children who receive free school meals, and in some schools they also get a breakfast, don't get this support during the holidays. And we also know that parents will often not eat in the holidays so they can provide for their children. There were different responses. Clackmannanshire Council were not preparing any support, reporting that they'd previously run a pilot that had resulted in a lot of food waste, but they would explore options for next summer. The other local authorities, Stirling, Perth and Kinross and Fife, were running a variety of targeted schemes which were referral-based and built around a programme of activities with meals. I recognise the efforts that are being made, but also recognise the scale of the demand. And speaking to food banks, community cafes and support organisations, I could see that they were preparing for an increase in demand. So as part of Challenge Poverty Week, I held a round table in Kirkcaldy on Monday with Fife Gingerbread, Home Start, Citizens Advice Bureau, Linton Lane Centre, Kirkcaldy YMCA, Glenrothes Food Bank and Kirkcaldy Food Bank, the Ore Valley Housing Association, the Poverty Alliance and Fife Council, to give an opportunity to discuss the provision that was available over the summer holidays, what the demand was like, how did the organisations respond to that and what was the best way forward. So issues raised included sustainable funding, the reach of the provision, the extent of the referral system, how to avoid stigma and how to recognise hidden hunger. I want to thank everyone who came along to the discussion and also sincerely thank them for the effort in responding to a desperate need in Fife to reduce food insecurity and build resilience in our communities. But what can Parliament do to make their jobs easier? I think we need a comprehensive food bill as soon as possible that includes a right to food. This would give a statutory underpinning to efforts to tackle food insecurity. We should do all we can to raise income levels. Food insecurity is a symptom of poverty. We need to ensure the benefits system delivers a recognised minimum income standard. We need to ensure that the new income supplement which the Scottish Government is committed to is as ambitious as possible, and I will continue to argue that a top-up to the child benefit is a good way to do this. And by strengthening the Scottish Welfare Fund, we can ensure that people receive the cash support that prevents them having to access emergency food provision. And finally, we must do all we can to avoid in-work poverty. And while I have focused on food, poverty has many negative impacts on people's lives and our society, and we must all redouble our efforts to end it.
Thank you. I'll call Neil Findlay to be followed by Michelle Ballantyne, and Ms Ballantyne will be the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Findlay,
thanks, Presiding Officer, and thank Elaine Smith for bringing the debate forward. People have mentioned 1 million people who cannot afford the basics to live a decent life. If that doesn't get you angry and emotional, then I think you must have a heart of stone. Across Scotland, we see the educational attainment gap growing, a mental health crisis unfold before our eyes, with people desperate for help but unable to get it. I recently spoke to a group of young carers. Out of 15 of them, 13 of them had sought help for a mental health problem. We see 1,000 people a year die from the effect of drugs. Food bank use, as people have said, is rising, not falling. We have a housing crisis where people can't afford a deposit. They've been ripped off by exploitative landlords and councils not even remotely able to meet housing demand. And all of these issues affect women, the low-paid, the poor, the weak, disabled and the vulnerable most. And we've had report after report after report on this issue over the years. This week, we all come here and we stick our badges on and we go and get our photo taken and we take part in a debate and we all feel very good that we've contributed something. We might do events in our constituency and nothing much changes. In fact, poverty is increasing, and shamefully, and I don't think this has got anywhere near the coverage it deserves. Last week, life expectancy in this country is falling for the first time in many years. That is an utter disgrace. It's an abject failure of public policy. Now, we know that Tory benefit cuts, the stagnation of wages, precarious work, public spending cuts, a tax on local services, all leave communities and families struggling and isolated and without enough money to pay bills, buy food and clothes, pay the rent, never mind buy luxuries like toys or books or a short break for children. And we know that when you have a Tory government, poverty increases just as much as night follows day. There was no mention of food banks or disability cuts or suicide rates increasing in Theresa May's speech yesterday, or indeed from Mr Stewart today. Don't give us compassion today about the extent of poverty in Scotland, while cheering the very people who are causing that yesterday in that speech. But if we want to do something different here, then we need a concerted cross-government response, making the eradication of health and wealth inequality the core objective of government policy. I believe, and I always have done, that responsibility and accountability for this should lie in Scotland with the First Minister and at a UK level with the Prime Minister, with every other minister and every other department contributing to an overall plan to eradicate those inequalities. And where the government does have powers, it must use them and it must act. So in Scotland, we could make work pay through a living wage of at least £10 an hour in all contracts that the Scottish Government give out. We've got the power to do it. We need to end the cuts to council services, which disproportionately impact on those groups I mentioned earlier. This could happen with the political will. We have the power. We need to invest in childcare and policies like North Lanarkshire's school meals policy. Again, We have the power. We need to increase the money going into people's pockets, the pockets of the most needy. We could do that by, for example, topping up child benefit. And I fail to understand the First Minister's logic when she argues for universal provision in relation to tuition fees, the baby box, bus passes, all of which I support, by the way, and then argues against universal provision for putting extra money in people's pockets. It is just complete and utter inconsistency. And we need to ensure that no one in our country sleeps rough or has no food to provide for their family. We have the power. We could do it with the political will. And I think we need to end the failing war on drugs and declare a national public health crisis. Again, we have the power. And if education really is the government's priority, then the approach is failing as the gap between the rich and poor is growing, not narrowing. We need to reverse this, and we have the power. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, these debates come and go, and in many areas things are getting worse instead of better. If the government were to act in the areas I have identified and other people have, then they would have our full support, because tackling poverty and inequality should be the overriding priority of any government, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mr Finlay. I call Michelle Ballantyne and then the closing speech of the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm actually grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate marking Challenge Poverty Week. And I do thank Elaine Smith for bringing this motion for the members' debate. I'm sure there have been many interesting contributions, and maybe I might be glad I didn't hear some of them. But I do apologise for my absence, because actually I was hosting a delegation of alpacas outside, and I hope when we finish some of you will actually be able to go and see them as well. But
just before you go on, Ms Ballantyne, I should advise that the presiding officer gave permission to Ms Ballantyne. It was the presiding officer's decision. Ms Ballantyne.
Thank you. And I was just about to say, and I was very grateful that the presiding officer did actually give me permission to be late, because I did want to come and participate. Look, while we may disagree on many things, the one thing we do all agree on is that it is shameful that 1 million Scots are living in poverty. And despite some of the commentary today, and obviously there's a lot of accusation that it's all the fault of people who sit over this side, it actually isn't a situation that has arisen from just the actions of a single government, but rather administrations of all colours are responsible to one degree or another. And however, and I would say this to everybody from all sides and all colours, here in Scotland we have been handed a golden opportunity to tackle poverty and end the destructive cycle that has blighted our country for so long. The new Child Poverty Act sets out an ambitious target of reducing child poverty to only 10% of children by 2030. Of course, to advance this, the way we measure poverty would also have to change, because if you take it as it is as a medium, we're always going to have people by that measure in poverty. So I hope that this chamber, when it goes forward, will give consideration to the new indicator of poverty that was recently published by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where it looks at income and expenditure and looks at that impact that actually has, because that's what's really important, is how that is measured and what families actually have to live on and what surplus they've got to bring opportunity into their lives. The Social Security Scotland Act is now enshrined in Scots law.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Michelle Ballantyne for taking the intervention. But would Michelle Ballantyne agree with me that with the welfare reform and with some of our constituents getting less money as a consequence of that, it then means that they've got less money to actually live on, unfortunately putting more people, our constituents, into poverty?
Michelle Ballantyne.
Yeah, I'm not going to dispute that. There is no doubt that there have been winners and losers across the welfare reform. And I think that's something that everybody's monitoring at the moment, and everybody's looking at where the impacts are, whether those are right, whether they're wrong, and what needs to be adjusted to actually do it. And it would be utterly wrong to say that the UK government isn't looking at that too, because they are. They are monitoring it, and you can already see that they've been making changes and adjustments. This is a radical change to the way welfare is delivered. And we have to make sure that it is being altered and adjusted and made fit for purpose, so that
that all people can look at it, and whilst they might not always agree with the decisions, that they can say it was fair. And we now in Scotland have a real part in that. As I say, with the new Social Security Scotland Act enshrined in Scots law, and the devolution of 11 benefits, and now we've seen, obviously, Social Security is now open, and I was really pleased to have been and visited on Monday, and I'm going back again to talk to them again. And I think we have to remember that both the Poverty Act and the Social Security gained unanimous support across this chamber. And that's a clear sign that when it comes to poverty, there is a will within these four walls to come together and take decisive action. However, passing legislation is just the beginning. Solving something as complex and deep-rooted as poverty cannot be eliminated by just passing the laws, or indeed by focusing only on social security. And that's why I welcome today's motion. It recognises that the key to lifting people out of economic hardship is by boosting their income and ensuring their participation in society, by providing them with a range of choices and options to build a better life. Now, I've stood in this chamber and made this point before, but I do feel it deserves to be repeated, and I know some other members, since I've come back in, have also done this. You know, we must take a wider, joined-up approach when it comes to poverty. And when this chamber debated the Child Poverty Bill, I made the point then that education and underattainment has been identified as a key contributory driver of child poverty. It restricts the life chances of our young people and prevents them actually breaking the cycle as they go on to be parents themselves. Now, I take Alison Johnson's point that actually it is extremely difficult to be effective in the classroom as a child if you haven't got a full stomach. And those are sort of things that we can address, and there are ways to do it that sit outside of social security as well. And I see I'm having the pen waved at me, so I'm going to lose a bit of my speech. But I just wanted to say that one of the things, very quickly, if you'll allow me some leeway, that actually one of the things myself, and I've spent most of my life working with people in poverty, that's what my professional background is, and I feel really strongly about it, there isn't enough communication between services. The third sector do a phenomenal job. You know, the public sector try their hardest to do a phenomenal job, but the communication between everybody and the joining up of how we approach things from government right the way down to the front line isn't that great at times.
And there you must conclude. You've had 6 minutes. Okay. Thank you very much. And now, I have a feeling this isn't a point of order, and if it isn't, I'm cutting you off.
You can cut me off if you like. My understanding is if you're not in time for the summing up of a debate and any other one...
That isn't a point of order. I
well,
said at the beginning... No, please sit down, Miss White. Miss White, don't argue with me. Please sit down. The presiding officer had given advance permission to Miss Valentine to not be in here for the start. It's the presiding officer's ruling, and that you must just have to accept. I now take Eileen Campbell, please. Would you sum up, please, on behalf of the Government Cabinet Secretary?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And like others this afternoon, I also thank Elaine Smith for bringing this members' debate forward during Challenge Poverty Week. A chance for Parliament to collectively assert and raise our voices against poverty in Scotland and, in her words, put aside some of the party politics with a focus instead of putting forward ideas. And that should, though, not necessarily come without the appropriate challenge to government and people in power. But the space that has been created today has provided members with an opportunity to consider what more needs to be done to challenge poverty, and to Elaine Smith, I'm appreciative for her providing that space. And I commend the work that she's mentioned that is going to be happening in Coatbridge, and the storytelling, because I think it's people's stories and those individual stories that are powerful and illustrate the horrifying impact of poverty in Scotland. And this week there are also have been a number of key poverty publications published during this Poverty Week, including the Scottish Government's annual report on UK government welfare reforms and the Poverty in Scotland 2018 report published by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, launched also at the Storytelling Centre, again ensuring that people's experiences and their stories are at the forefront of the consideration about what we need to do to challenge poverty. But both those reports highlighted the ongoing UK government austerity and the devastating impact it will be, leading to more families falling into poverty, both those in and out of work, and is forecast to increase child poverty in Scotland. £3.7 billion reduced from the benefit income of people in Scotland by 2021. And those welfare reforms have explicitly focused on reducing benefit generosity towards families with children. And this is affecting the priority families identified in the Scottish Government's Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan. For example, over the first year of implementation of the two-child limit, around 3,800 larger families in Scotland saw their incomes reduced by up to £2,780 simply for having more than 2 children. And this situation is only set to worsen year on year. The reform estimated to bring about the biggest reduction in spending in Scotland, around £370 million by 2021, is the benefit freeze. And the Scottish Government has taken action to mitigate the impact of UK Government welfare reform policies, including spending an expected £125 million this year alone. But unless the UK Government reverses the reductions made in social security spending, it will be even more challenging for the Government to meet the ambitious targets in the Child Poverty Scotland Act. And we'll be challenging that poverty with one hand tied behind our back.
Michelle Valentine.
Agreeing that there has been a cut in actual spend in the budget, does the Minister accept there's been an increase in the percentage point of the amount within the whole envelope of government spending in terms of benefits? So it's gone up from 34 to 35% of overall government spend. And does the Minister feel that actually when she talks about mitigation and actually not doing it, that this to some degree is about choices about where you spend money on education or health?
Please, it's a short intervention, not another speech. Cabinet Secretary, just a wee minute.
Sorry, okay.
I know you're desperate to reply. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Sorry, Presiding Officer. I'm talking about the mitigation we're having to spend to cope with and cover up and sweep up and clear up the mess that's been left by the UK Government. And unless the Tories accept that, then to be quite frank, it's probably not worth the contributions that you make in this chamber unless you're going to adequately challenge poverty with it and amongst your own party colleagues and at Westminster Government, and perhaps better suited to having meetings with alpacas than thinking about contributing to this debate. Now, this report, however, these reports this week also, however, outline the importance of continued concerted Scottish Government action in this area and need to maintain a strong focus on child poverty across all policy areas. And that's exactly what we're doing. In developing the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan, ministers recognised that it wasn't the responsibility of just one Cabinet Secretary to deliver on child poverty. And the delivery plan took a cross-government approach. And ministerial colleagues have been looking at opportunities this week and beyond to raise awareness of the reality of poverty in Scotland, to highlight again what is needing to be done and what is being done to tackle this, and encourage debate and discussion about how to identify more solutions. And our delivery plan is already making progress and having an impact on a number of areas. We have agreed a new national minimum level of £100 for school clothing grants, which started this academic year, benefiting around 120,000 families this year. Choices that we are making in the here and now to mitigate and help families cope with their poverty. Social Security Scotland made its first payments of the Carers Allowance Supplement in September, putting an extra £442 in carers' pockets. And last month, Fair for You was the first lender to borrow from the £2.5 million Affordable Credit Fund. And the Scottish Government has also invested £1 million in this fund alongside Carnegie and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to increase choices for people on low incomes and provide genuine alternatives to high-cost credit providers.
Neil Findlay.
For taking an intervention. I wonder if she'd answer a very direct question. Why is it that the baby box, bus pass and tuition fees help people out of poverty, but a £5 a week increase in child benefit wouldn't?
We heard
Cabinet Secretary.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, we heard during the First Minister's questions that what we are wanting to do with the money and resource that we have is to direct and target that in the best and the most appropriate way to lift more children out of poverty. And actually the analysis that we have done of the Give Me 5 campaign, while it's absolutely appropriate that they take forward that campaign and raise rightly the impact that it may have, actually it won't raise as many children from poverty as the income supplement that we're taking forward work on in the here and now to deliver more for children across the country.
Mr Findlay.
So how is it that then those other policies that I've mentioned do help? Can you tell us how they help, but this wouldn't?
Cabinet Secretary.
A whole host of policies and initiatives and things that we're doing in the here and now to help families cope with the poverty that has been inflicted on them through welfare reforms and the money that has been taken out from their pockets. And all of these things contribute to ensuring the well-being of our country. And actually, I think it's quite an important point to recognise that we want to target and direct our funding to impact the most families, the most children across the country. That's the most appropriate way in which we use and target our funds, and to continue to do what we are doing, but continue to do it with one hand behind our back. And again, I think it is probably appropriate to reiterate Sandra White's point. You know, if we want us to really radically transform the society that we live in, then perhaps it's about thinking about what powers do we need here and now to actually impact and transform lives and bring people out of poverty. And again, unless the Labour Party want to think about that, then we're going to get stuck in a crisis of not being able to do things and take forward policies without having to mitigate the impact of decisions taken elsewhere. Can I make a bit of progress, if that's okay? And we're also, again, you know, we're taking forward other things which are around impacting and targeting people who need help most. So the Best Start Pregnancy and Baby Grant, which we're working towards making before Christmas, is now going to be delivered 6 months earlier than planned, and we're going to be providing payments to low-income families with £600 on the birth of their first child and £300 on the birth of any subsequent child. And further payments of £250 for each child will be introduced by summer 2019 at key transition points in their life. Again, we're also taking forward work to maintain a focus on poverty and work across all of government, and we've implemented the Fairer Scotland duty. And that asks all public bodies actively to consider how they can reduce inequalities of outcomes caused by disadvantage when making their decisions. And members made comments on other particular issues, and I completely agree with Alison Johnson, Stewart McMillan and Claire Baker about the unacceptability that in a country as prosperous as Scotland that people are struggling to put food on their table. Everyone has a right to food, and people shouldn't be forced to turn to food banks for that. And that's why, again, the programme for government we announced is increasing funding for our Fair Food Fund to provide a dignified response to food insecurity. £2 million of this £3.5 million funding will focus on supporting for families during the school holidays. And we know that, again, we need radical action in order for us to achieve the ambitious targets that we've set out in the Child Poverty Act. And that's why we have set out our intention to develop a new income supplement which will provide additional financial support for people who are living in poverty, ensuring it tops up the income sufficiently to lift those households out of poverty. And while I can list that suite of actions and policies and strategies to make an impact towards eradicating poverty, there is much more we can and need to do, and we must do if we want to shift the curve in child poverty. And that means ensuring every member of the government recognises their role. That tackling poverty doesn't just mean work by me or Shirley-Ann Somerville, but we work across transport, the economy, work and employment, are maximising the impact of the policies in those areas. That while we work to tackle the social injustice of poverty with a hand tied behind our back, that we continue to exert our influence and take action that we need whilst continuing to mitigate the worst impacts of welfare reform. And while I did hear Alexander Stewart acknowledge the appropriate and pertinent intervention from Neil Findlay, the uncomfortable truth for the Conservative is that acknowledgement won't stop the trauma, the lack of food and the lack of dignity people in Scotland face as a result of welfare reforms. Acknowledgement of that problem won't put food on people's table. And that's why Challenge Poverty Week is important and will continue to be so until we solve this. And that means stopping in-work poverty, where folk work hard and yet cannot get out of the bit, removing the barriers facing people with disability to enter the workplace and reversing the gender pay gap, and being ambitious in our plans to introduce an income supplement. So by preventing poverty, we end the horrifying impact of it felt across our communities. And I don't think anybody in government or anyone across the Parliament will be content by just sticking on a badge or getting a pic or a selfie done to mark this week. The position that I have in this government is a privilege, and with that comes opportunity. And I have to say that with this week and with this opportunity, that we have a chance as a government, as a Parliament, to come together and understand that every week, every day, every week and every year, until we see the change we need happen across the country, that will have to drive our effort and our work. And as Elaine Smith, reimagining and creating that good society where everyone has their fair chance to flourish.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate, and I suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:30.
It's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK Government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.